I've heard a lot of stories from my grandfather. He was a detective for 27 years of his life, and I grew up listening to the tales of he and his fellow lawmen. As a child, he obviously amended the stories quite a bit to make them age appropriate. But as I grew up, more and more the true stories came out. Starting about 2 years ago, my grandpa got sick. He's been on a slow decline ever since, and while it's been one of the hardest things I've ever had to deal with, his illness acted as the catalyst for a set of stories he'd never before brought up. He said he kept them filed away in a deep folder he doesn't like to open. He calls them the impossible ones. But this last one, the one he told me last night, he says it's still the one that keeps him up some nights, the one he thinks about every day. He says he's looked over the case files more times than he can remember, done a full re-examination of it all more times than he can remember, and it never makes any more sense. He said he only told me now because he can feel in his bones that he doesn't have a lot of time left. So what follows is my transcription of the case verbatim. I've only excluded his coughing fits and any other off-topic remarks made during the telling of the case. The case was a murder-kidnapping. At least that's what it looked like, and it was me and Olson. I've told you about him. There was a family, the Nibbles. There was Benjamin, the husband, Jennifer, the wife, and Katie, their 6-year-old daughter. One of their neighbors had gone out for the paper around 6 a.m. and saw the Nibbles' front door wide open. When she went over to see if everything was okay, she saw the wife's body. The neighbor called 911 and eventually we were sent over there. Now, when I say there was no outward sign of struggle, I mean it. There was no sign whatsoever that anything had happened. Well, except for the dead body. But even her body, there were no wounds, no marks of any kind. I'm getting ahead of myself. On our way to the house, it came over the radio that the husband and daughter were unaccounted for. If you're thinking, the husband did it, we did too. Obviously. Problem was, both the family's cars were still in the garage, so we think they might be on foot. Some officers canvassed the neighborhood and no one had seen them, including 2 neighbors who were on their porches for hours starting into the early morning. No one had heard any kind of commotion coming from their house either. I mentioned the wife's body. She didn't have a hair out of place. She was on her back in the kitchen. About a third of her upper body was under the table. We found out after the autopsy that, well, she'd just died. There was no cause that they could find. She'd been a perfectly healthy woman, didn't smoke, didn't drink, ate right, exercised. It was like she'd just blinked her eyes and gone from alive to dead. Anyways, we searched the house. We went through it with a fine-tooth comb, basement to attic. Found nothing. No evidence of a struggle, no weapon, nothing. So we left. We'd spent hours in that house. Thought maybe we should come back in a day or two with some fresh eyes. We went over to where Benjamin worked. He was a supervisor at a lumber yard. According to his coworkers, he'd shown up at work that morning just before 5 a.m. When he got in, he worked on this narrow crate thing that he was building in his office. Something he told his coworkers was a project for his house. According to the other morning supervisor, he'd only built about half of the thing. Around 6:15, he was running to the bathroom, and that was the last anyone saw him. They never saw him leave. While we were at the lumber yard, I'd realized I'd left my notes at the house. We drove back over there and we got there while they were taking the wife's body away. As soon as we walked in, the stench hit us like a bus. It was what a newly discovered but long dead body smells like. We knew it obviously couldn't have been the wife. We asked a few officers and forensic folks that were still at the house what the smell was, and they told us that it had only started a few minutes before we'd gotten back there. I'm not exaggerating when I say the smell was everywhere in the house. I've smelled some dead ones before, but this smelled like every wall in the place was lined with corpses. Pretty quickly, we found that the smell was strongest leading up to the attic. Now, I told you before, we checked the attic. I checked it myself probably 5 times, but we went back up, me and Olsen. I was up the little pull-down ladder first, and when I poked my head up, I saw something. I saw a piece of wood, like a box, a crate. It was shaped kind of like a rifle case, maybe 3 foot tall, 2 foot wide, 6 inches deep, rectangular. It was standing straight up, and there was blood leaking from it. We call the photographers and all the people in there. They all do their thing, and finally they pull out the nails and open the box. Out falls the husband. Think about that. This guy was maybe 5'10", 140 pounds, and he was put in a 3 foot by 2 foot by 6 inch crate. His bones were just a mess. His insides, all his organs, they were flattened. They were just wet, squishy pieces of fabric almost. He was stuffed in there like, I don't know what like. He was just a rectangle of blood, skin, and parts. His skin had the discoloration of a body that had been dead for about 2 weeks, which obviously didn't make sense since they'd seen him at work that morning. He was also missing his eyeballs. We were standing there trying to rationalize the whole situation when something caught everyone's ears at the same time. A little girl's voice calling out for help. What followed was a sequence of all the people in the attic and the rest of the house and the people out on the lawn and the few people that were standing on the other side of the yellow tape, all saying some variation of the phrase, "It sounds like it's coming from over there." Problem was, every single person swore they heard it coming from a different direction. Me, I heard it from right above me. No kidding. The first time I heard that little voice say, I looked straight up, right up to the rafters. Of course she wasn't there. It was just my brain's response to where it perceived her voices coming from. We had to listen to every one of those people tell us where they thought they heard her voice come from. People swore up and down they'd heard it come from the kitchen cabinets, the bedroom closets, the refrigerator, the tank behind the toilet, for God's sake. People on the street said they heard it from underneath cars, behind trees, on the sides of the house next to the Nibbles. Everyone heard her voice for about 1.5 minutes, 2 minutes tops. And then it just stopped. About 2 weeks after that day, the wife's sister had a funeral for Jennifer. It went fine. They buried her and all that. The husband's remains were cremated not long after that and put on display in a different part of the cemetery. I don't remember exactly when it happened, but at some point over the next few weeks after he was cremated, someone stole his urn. It was missing for about 6 months, and then one day we get a call. Find out a groundskeeper at the cemetery had called in. The wife had been dug up and posed like she was leaning against the grave just relaxing. She had the urn in her hands, but it was wrapped in skin. Well, they tested it, and it was the husband's skin. They'd pretty well reconstructed the man after he was poured out of the crate, and he hadn't been missing any skin. And remember how I told you the skin was discolored? Well, this skin was perfectly preserved. And inside the urn, with his ashes, there were 3 eyeballs. Only one of them was the husband's. It's been, 22 years? And I still hear that girl's voice calling out sometimes. And I don't mean my memory or mind is playing tricks on me. Ask your grandmother. She's heard her. The same 6-year-old voice. And then, I remember it was May 12th, 2007, I was going to pick up a pizza for us. I saw that girl. I saw Katie Nebel. I don't mean I saw her grown up. I don't mean I saw a little girl that looked like her when she was young. I mean I saw the fucking kid. She was standing outside the Walgreens right by our house crying. I pulled over and got out of the car and I started to walk up to her. I can't explain how I felt in that moment. I was nauseous. I was so afraid. Terrified. More than I'd ever been. She looked right at me and said in that same voice, "Help me, please." I don't know what the hell happened, but she just disappeared. I never took my eyes off her. She was just there 1 second, gone the next. I thought I was losing my mind. I was seriously worried about my mental health. But then, about an hour and a half after I got back home, the phone rang. It was Olson. Hadn't talked to the son of a bitch in 5 years and he called me that night. Said he saw Katie Nibbles sitting on a bus stop bench crying. He lived on the other side of the country. Killed himself the next day. There's never a good ending to those stories, I know. If there was, they wouldn't be the impossible ones. I'd have figured them out one way or another. And I know I've told you some others, but that girl's voice still wakes me up in the middle of the night. Sometimes I hear it downstairs, sometimes from the bathroom. Sometimes I'll be laying on my side facing away from your grandmother, and it'll sound like it's coming from her mouth. We never found a trace of that girl. Nothing. I told you what they do with those cases. God damn it. I'm sorry. That's it. That's the worst one. Some of the other ones might sound worse to you, but that's the worst for me. Okay. He told me that he didn't want to talk about it anymore, and said that now that he's told me, he'd never talk about it again. He did, however, tell me about a number of his other cases. I told my grandpa about the response he got from his case I posted last week, and he was thrilled. Going through the comments together put a smile on his face like I haven't seen in some time. He saw that so many people wanted to hear more of the impossible ones, and he encouraged me to transcribe more of the cases he told me about, in addition to agreeing to both tell me more and answer any questions you may have. So here we go. Back before me and Olson were partners, I was with this guy Manthe. He was a weird son of a bitch, but he was good at the job. He'd been on about a decade longer than me, and he'd taught me quite a bit, as a matter of fact. He was the one that told me there were times where I wouldn't be able to solve the case. He said it wouldn't be because of me or lack of skill or anything like that. Wouldn't be evidence. Wouldn't be the witnesses. He said there'd be times when... How'd he put it? You'll have all the pieces to the puzzle. You'll know what the puzzle should look like. But for a reason you don't know and can't understand, they just won't fit. Back in the late 80s, we drew a suspected homicide at this apartment building. Real pile of shit. Neighbors had complained about a smell coming from one of the units, so some officers went to check it out. Ends up we get the call. The girl was found wrapped completely in dental floss. I mean, each of her fingers and toes were individually wrapped, as were each of her limbs, her torso, her ears, and the rest of her head. And then another layer went over everything. It was so wrapped, none of her skin was visible. Can you imagine that? How long that must have taken? There were no weave patterns either. They just wrapped it around once, then continued with each new wraparound touching the one before it. How much floss do you think that took? Hundreds of rolls, if not more. Thousands, maybe. Never seen anything like it but that one time. Anyways, they identified the girl. She was some kid, 17 years old, from a couple states over. If I remember right, her name was... what was it? Kelly. That's it. Now, the guy who lived in the apartment hadn't been seen around the building for a few days. We talked to the neighbors, people that lived on the same floor, a few others maybe. Apparently this guy, his name was Lucas, he kept to himself. We went to talk to the neighbors. None of them knew his name, and a few of them they'd go, "Oh, do you mean the guy from whatever his unit was, 512 I think, whatever. Guy's an asshole." Or something to that effect. He never talked to anybody, never nodded in the halls, nothing. He'd lived in the building 6 years, but for the last year, 10 months or so, no one had seen him. His rent was paid by check through the mail, and he'd had his mail forwarded to a P.O. box. So, the scene. His apartment was dark. We'd shown up there in the morning around 9 a.m., but his apartment made it feel like it was midnight. He'd painted the windows black, same with the walls. But the walls were... You know those cliché ransom letters where all the words are made up of different letters cut out from magazines? It was that, but over every inch of every black wall in the place. The messages were disturbing. I don't remember what it all said verbatim, but they were just these sort of vague confessions. "It's almost the end. He's coming for me. Please stop." That type of stuff. It was a 2-bedroom apartment, and floor to ceiling, wall to wall, it was just hundreds and thousands of magazine letters making words that formed this guy's pleas for help. Fingerprint folks came in and did their thing. Like I said, this guy lived alone. Never had a noise complaint, no one ever saw him with anyone else. Neighbors in the next units over and across the hall never heard a peep from his apartment, not even a TV or radio. But somehow there was no less than, 90 some odd different fingerprints all over his house? Weirder than that is all the fingerprints were all carefully placed. Like one person went up to the table, wall, refrigerator, door, whatever, placed their thumb down, then another person came up, placed theirs down, and so on and so forth. The entire apartment, every surface had these fingerprints, intricately placed, evenly spaced. We found out that the only ones they identified, 2 sets of fingerprints, one belonged to Lucas and another to a woman who had died in West Virginia in the early 60s, a few years before he was born. So the girl that was found dead in the apartment, she had no connection to Lucas that anyone could find. She also had no fingerprints on her, but it didn't look like anyone had intentionally wiped her down. They said she'd been dead for a week and that the cause of the death was, get this, suffocation by dental floss. And in the course of her autopsy, they found that a few of her organs were also wrapped in floss the same way her body was. Her heart, liver, a lung, her kidney, her spleen, all wrapped up in dental floss. And her stomach was bursting at the seams with it, just like her esophagus. Anyways, we had our suspect, this Lucas guy. We started digging, looking for associates, places he spent time, things like that. Pretty soon we found out he did some off-the-book works at a landscaping company. Guy there tells us he hadn't been to work in 3 days and that he'd figured he'd quit. We pulled a few more threads, but nothing seemed to pan out. It looked like this guy killed Kelly and then went off the grid. Then about a week and a half after the case, we'd put Lucas's pictures everywhere, and if I'm not mistaken, the higher-ups told us to tell everyone it was for robbery. We started getting calls from different businesses saying Lucas had come in. Stopped for gas, got a burger at McDonald's, picked up shampoo at a grocery store. All these menial tasks, probably 15 different things. Problem was, he apparently did all these things at locations that spanned the whole city. And he did them all at the same damn time. 10:48 a.m. Something like that. All the security camera footage matched up. His credit card records matched up. All the purchases happened at the exact same time. And I'll be damned if it wasn't him at all the locations. Not a lookalikes, but him. Now a lot of stuff I'm telling you. It's weird, yeah? When it all happened, that's really all it was. It was just weird. Odd. It was never really all that scary. Some things were, of course, but it generally was just stuff that boggled the mind. When we watched those security tapes, though, it's hard to explain it. Me, Manthe, and anyone else who was in the room at the time, we watched these tapes. Every time. I think there were 11 places we had to watch the tapes. And every time he'd stand for just a few seconds, 5 to 10 seconds, and then he would just stare at the cameras, stone-faced. And it was like he was looking into my soul. I can only describe how it felt for me, but I know for a fact the others felt the same way. It felt like someone was squeezing their fist around my heart. The breath left me. I started sweating. It was the worst fear, pure terror. 2 of the security guys had to leave the room. One started hyperventilating, another threw up. It only lasted as long as we were looking straight at the cameras. When he'd look away, everyone would breathe a sigh of relief. It was... Anyways, Manthe came to me the last day of us going over the security cameras and told me he had something. Son of a bitch had gone over the pictures from the apartment of all the magazine letters and he found a pattern. There were certain letters that were written in a particular font. He put those through a cipher. What do you call it? Caesarean shift? If you moved the letters around, I don't remember how many, 4, 5, something, it made a name that kept repeating. It was the longest of long shots, but we started looking into Bruce Hiller. Turns out Bruce Hiller had another apartment over in town near our town. We talked to the people there. They tell us he's the nicest guy in the world. They don't see him much, but whenever they do, he's polite, conversational, and a really good guy. His apartment is immaculate. I mean, it looked like he went over the entire place with a Q-tip every day, every hour. The building itself was, It was decent, kinda run down, but his place, for what it was spotless. We go through everything, and pretty soon it's time to go check the basement storage unit. The way they were set up was that they were partitioned off with little wood and wire doors. You could see everything. In Lucas's or Bruce's, whatever his damn name was, in his, it was packed from floor to ceiling with stuff on either side of the door. But we could see through the door. And there he was, towards the back of the unit with his back to us, reaching up onto a shelf. We could barely see him, just kind of make out his silhouette. The only light down there was a single bulb hanging from the ceiling with pull strings. We shine our lights into his unit, pull our weapons, tell him to turn around slowly and keep his hands up. He doesn't move. He just stays there, reaching up on the shelf. We move forward a bit, keep telling him to turn around, show us his hands, blah blah blah. But he doesn't move an inch. The building manager had rapport with him apparently, so we get him and he tries pleading with him to turn around. But Lucas just kept standing there with his arm up and his back to us. Manager unlocks the door, we get him out of there. Now this was a year or two before tasers really started catching on, so we didn't have an option. We inch our way towards the guy, and as we get closer it becomes clear. When I say he's not moving, I mean he's not moving. He's standing as still as a statue. Pretty soon we realize he's not breathing. We kept our weapons up, kept our lights on him, kept yelling and all that shit. Did it all by the book. But we got up to him and confirmed that he wasn't breathing. We call in the troops. When it was time to move the body, they had to tip him. It was like rigor mortis had set in while he was reaching up to the shelf. It was his face, though. It was the most anguished, terrified look I'd ever seen. Picture yourself screaming at the top of your lungs and think about what your face looks like when you do that. That was his face. We asked the people who lived around if they'd heard anything. Of course they hadn't. When Manthe saw the guy, it did something to him. I mean, I saw Lucas's face. It scared the Christ out of me, no two ways about it. Gave me that same feeling when we watched the security tapes. But Manthe, the guy never said another word. Ever. Never spoke to me, his wife, his kids. Never said another word as far as I know. Last I heard, he was living in an old folks' home. Poor son of a bitch just looks out the window all day. That was some years ago, though. I hope for his sake he's dead, terrible as it sounds. They did an autopsy, and, well, it was something with his heart, blood pressure, something. But what it came down to was that he was literally scared to death. I didn't think it was real, but they assured us it was the only explanation. That was it. He died. We never found anything else on his connection to the girl, why they had an alias, why they had a second apartment, nothing. We did find out what the tip of his finger was touching when he reached up on that shelf, though. There was a ball of dental floss, maybe the size of, I don't know, a racket ball, you know, one of those bouncy blue ones. Got a call a day or two later. They told us that inside that ball of floss, 7 human teeth. Far as I know, none of them have ever been identified. It was, 1993, I think. You know, after a while these things start to blend together. Dates, some names, and I'm an old man now. That doesn't help. But I remember the important things. I don't know if it's that I just have a good memory or if these things were just burnt into my mind. Ah well, no matter. We drew a body in a department store, Kohl's department store, the one right up there on North Avenue. Well, this one started off weird right off the bat. Someone placed the call for the body around 2 in the afternoon. This is a department store that opened at 9 in the morning, 8, whatever. But it had been open, people walking around the place for hours. So we think, okay, maybe the body was hidden somewhere in the building. Nope. The body was right inside the main entrance of the place, right by the first checkout. Someone must have dropped the body there and took off, right? These are all things we're thinking on the drive over. The body was posed. There was no way someone had been in a rush when they did it, and there's no way that people just didn't notice someone doing it. It would have been impossible to miss. Did I mention it was a kid? Yeah, he was maybe 10, 11 years old. The pose was... Remember when we watched The Exorcist? When the girl comes down the stairs bent over backwards walking on her hands and feet? That's how this boy was. But, not moving. His back was arched, stomach facing up, just looking at us upside down. His face just pain. Just pure pain. All he had on was a pair of white briefs. This kid. God. So we were there. And the first thing we ask is, well, what'd the guy look like? Someone must have seen him. But no one could recall seeing anything. Not even the lady who'd been standing at the register this poor kid was posed in front of not 10 feet away. Now it's weird enough, the way the body is positioned. The position is weird enough, so we think rigor must have set in. The forensics folks get there. They take pictures and all that. Then, Christ. Then they, get ready to lay the body out, take a closer look at him. And as soon as the forensic guy, Benny I remember his name was, as soon as Benny lays a finger on him, and I mean the moment, the second, the microsecond, the exact instant his finger touched this kid's shoulder, the body just instantly crumples like a deflated balloon. I feel bad saying it. That poor kid. But it was just a puddle of a person. A puddle of skin. We find out later this kid's bones, they were dust. I don't mean that figuratively either. His bones were ground in just fine powder. The only mark on his body was a handprint around his neck, and the cause of death was determined to be strangulation. Christ, he was a goddamn kid. So anyways, we had our work cut out for us. This was a case where there were 40, 50, 60 witnesses. We checked the security camera, and it was the most bizarre, surreal thing. The whole thing was caught on tape. At about 10:30 that morning, a person wearing all black who kept his head down the whole time so we couldn't see his face came in holding the kid's hand. They went over to where the body was found, and the kid gets into the position we found him in. The guy then chokes the kid for about 40 seconds, killing him. People are just walking on by, walking around them, looking at them, but ignoring what's happened. The lady at the counter looked over a few times, didn't do a thing, just kept checking people out, doing her job. The guy finishes choking the kid, stands up, and the son of a bitch bows. And the part that really got me, people in the store gave him a round of applause. Then he just left. We were fuming. I remember I yelled at some of the employees and people that were in the store when they got there. What the hell were you doing just standing there? What the hell's matter with you son of a bitches? But not one of them could really explain their reaction to what had happened. They said they remembered seeing the guy, the kid, all of it. But when it was happening, it didn't feel like anything was going on. They said they all saw it, but instead of being like, what the hell, it just seemed like a normal thing. We asked everyone what the guy looked like, and they were all 100% sure in the description they gave of the guy's face. By what the witnesses gave us, the guy was either white, black, Hispanic, or Asian with brown, black, blonde, red, or gray hair, blue, green, or brown eyes, perfect, smooth, or extremely wrinkled skin, a big or small nose, and he had a picture-perfect set of pearly whites, Or he had a mouth that looked like he ate nothing but junk food and rocks and hadn't brushed a day in his life. It didn't make any sense, and with everyone having no real idea what they saw, none of what they gave us was a help at all. Remember I said the body was called in around 2 in the afternoon, and yeah, that means people were coming in and out just ignoring, not realizing, I don't know, whatever the hell was happening. But no one did anything about the body for almost 4 hours. We went to listen to the 911 call and we find out it came from the payphone right across the street from the Kohls at the McDonald's there. There used to be a payphone. Now, I heard a gravely deep voice, but Olsen, he heard someone more high-pitched. Doesn't really matter, just another weird thing about this. Operator goes, 911, yada yada yada. Guy says, did anyone call yet? Operator goes, I'm sorry? Did anyone call about the body yet? What body? Guy gets all frustrated, starts huffing and puffing and goes, there's a body at Kohl's, North Avenue. Do your fucking job, your goddamn job. Whatever he said. Then he goes, I don't have all day. We end up looking at the security tapes from the McDonald's there, and right after the guy did what he did to the boy, he walked over to the McDonald's and sat at one of the tables outside, and just sat there, staring at the Kohls, just waiting. Didn't budge an inch from about 10:35 until he called around 2. Just sat there like a statue, staring. Then he got up and made the call. After he hung up, he stood at the payphone, not moving, watching the Kohls from there. Watched the black and whites show up. Watched us show up. Then finally around 4, he just left. Took off down the street. This was one where we really didn't find anything. Never found out who the boy was. No one ever reported him missing. Certainly never found the guy that killed him. Get this though. A whole mess of people that were at the store when he did what he did, they ended up killing themselves. 6 or 7 of them in the months immediately following that day. Then I found out the case was reopened. Guy who took over it, young guy named Smith, he went to re-interview some of the witnesses, and 16 more had committed suicide. Guy didn't just kill the boy. Whatever he did, whatever he was, he took a whole lot more people with him. That boy though, I'll never get that side out of my eyes, the way he was posed. I just thank God I never saw anything like that again. Some of the other cases might have affected me more overall, but that sight, that was the one. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave a like, subscribe, and make sure you hit that notification bell. And if you want to help support the channel and get yourself some more content and some other perks, make sure you go check out my Patron page. Link in the description. And if you want to read more stories like this, make sure you go check out Nickbotic.com. He's a guy that writes a lot of amazing creepypastas, some of which I've featured on the channel like this one. He's got a lot more that I think you guys would enjoy, so I highly recommend you go check it out. You can also find a link to his website in the description. I appreciate you checking out this video, and I will catch you in the next one. And just remember to watch your back, because you never know who or what is watching. Bad bye.